Okay, Michiel. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at what we call a stage 2. And to give it some context, we've already acquired Medical 1, what we call the Medical 1 building in Atlanta, and we're far ahead with Medical 2, but we've now got a third medical building on the horizon. We've more than just found the city and found the building. We're now going to do stage 2. Why don't you share what stage 2 involves and how we actually go through that process?
No, it'd be my pleasure. So stage 2 in our terminology is what we call the go, no-go decision that we have to make. It basically means that the properties that we are looking at fits our criteria, and if it does fit our criteria, we release this project to our sponsors. Once we release the project, our sponsors will physically go to the owners of the building and actually negotiate what we call a letter of intent. That basically means that we have the intention to buy this building for that price, but subject to the fact that we must do the due diligence on the building.
Right.
Before we do this, we obviously receive the buildings or the proposals from our partners on the ground. In this specific case, our partner in Atlanta has shown these buildings to us previously, and these buildings has now come on the market, meaning that they're available for purchase, and they have compiled for us a first level pro forma calculation. What that basically means, it says how much rent we're going to get, what is the lease terms, and typically how much money do we need to buy it, and if we use a conservative 65% debt, this is the 35% that remains is what we need to actually conclude the deal from the investors.
Okay.
We have found that if we are looking at a medical portfolio of buildings, which is typically anything from $5 to about $15 million, it is we call it a sweet spot, meaning that it is just too large for individual investors, but too small for large
big
funds.
institutional ones, yeah.
So,
and you said 5 to 15, right? 1-5.
Correct.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, in this
that.
specific case, the deal together with the debt and all the associated costs is around about $15 million. This is what the current pricing is at the moment. And so from that perspective, that's the first tick. The second tick that we are looking for is that obviously in line with our medical trend, it is a medical buildings, and these medical buildings has medical practitioners in. The reason why we like medical practitioners is that if they install the imagery equipment, the dentist chairs, etc., that equipment is very expensive to install, and we call that intended installation cost, and if that is very high, they tend not to switch so easily.
Right.
That's the one reason why we're looking at it. And the second reason that we look at it, of course, if your neighborhood dentist is now for 15 years in the same place, why shall he move to another place?
Well, they'd lose a lot of clients.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to this end, we can secure, which is our fourth real criteria that we look at, is we look for long-term leases. The minimum that we like to have is 5 years. The best thing that we can have is 10 years, like we had on Oak Hill property.
On Medical 1, yeah.
Medical 1, where we had the 10-year lease. So once we know that the leases are in place and the quality of tenants, that's the second or the third aspect that we look at from a lease, is that they are basically blue chip clients or very established practitioners. So most of the cases, we also have the state which invest in these buildings or lease these buildings. It's called the Veterinary Association, and we have a case in these buildings as well. So that's another tick to us. And then lastly, we don't want to start with a building that's really in trouble,
Right.
but not a building that's completely healthy. So our idea why we say that like that is that we don't want more than typically 80% or less than 80% occupancy. That means the vacancy is about 20%. Why we don't want it 100% in the beginning, if we can, it would be nice, but normally if a building is 100% leased, then you pay a lot of money for it. So we found that if we have a building that's typically 85, 89% occupied, we have the opportunity to put the additional people in to make up the 100% later on in the deal, so that in the beginning we can buy it for cheap. The second thing that we also look at is that we view these as 5-year investment terms, and we work what we call the internal rate of return out over 5 years. What that basically means, it takes all the money that you put in and all the money you get as income per year, and the last year that you get, if we sell the building off, a capital income. If you combine that into a cash flow and you then put that into the internal rate of formula, you get an idea of returns. That's our way of comparing investments.
And it's sort of a standardized way too. It's not just for us.
Yeah.
It's a concept, if I can just add, the internal rate of return that many people struggle to understand. But once you understand what it is, it's very powerful, because it can be very difficult to compare two properties. One you buy for 10 million, one for 20 million, one's 40% occupied, one 80%. The chances of finding tenants are different, the rental incomes are different, the expenses, how do you compare them? But with an IRR, you can normalize for that, and it becomes very clear which in that moment might be the better investment.
Yeah, no, that is very true. I found that there's a lot of discussions that we must have with investors to understand it. Most people are thinking simply, I would put so much money in the bank, after a year I would get an interest rate of 10%, and they compare that typically in those fashion. So we can also, for investors, translate that into an interest rate equivalent.
Right.
But that is only to help the understanding.
Right.
Other criteria that we look at, and this is what we're busy verifying at the moment, the buildings should be typically, in our case, less than 10 years old. We don't want too old buildings.
And Medical 3 meets the mark?
I know the one building is specifically 6 years old, and I'm just waiting for the second building to get that information on us. So we actually visited the buildings when I was in October in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. We heard rumblings that these buildings will come on the market, so obviously we had the opportunity to see them.
Right.
And now they have come on the market, and we got the details for that. The other most obvious point is that the buildings should be typically in the vicinity of large hospitals.
Right.
I mean, this is following through on the theme of medical real estate. And the main reason for that is these doctors and practitioners typically do not want to be incorporated in the hospital doctor rooms, etc. They would like to be a little bit independent, just say 5 to 8 miles away from the hospital. From that perspective, all these buildings are less than 8 mile radius. The one is actually almost on the doorstep right across the street from the hospital.
Uh-huh.
So the other thing which is obvious, this has ticked our checklist for major centers in the United States, mm-hmm. which is that. Also ticked our logistic checklist, which is it has to be a place where there's a lot of international logistics, which Atlanta clearly meets the target. Right. It's just been recognized as the busiest airport system. Lastly, in terms of Atlanta property laws, or the state Georgia property laws, it is have a very good balance between tenants and landlords. So from that perspective, we believe our rights are properly secured.
So what you're really saying is that you're going through that process. Now, some of the answers are easy to get and it's self-evident or it's obvious. Others take a bit more time, even though you looked at the building, you know, one building's 6 years old, you're not sure on the age of the other one. We just want to avoid that we find out that even though it looked pretty, it's 17 years old and it's ready for a roof replacement, or the AC plants need to be replaced, etc., etc. Yeah. So it's a matter of doing could we call it the first phase of due diligence, where we find out that it meets our minimum criteria. Correct. And if it meets the minimum criteria, then we as an investment committee have a meeting and decide on that, and then release it for the next phase.
The next phase will happen now once the investment committee releases this on that it fits the criteria. We will then ask our local partner to go to the actual sellers of the building, go into contract with them, which we call a letter of intent, mm-hmm. which means we would like to buy these buildings at a certain price, subject to the due diligence period. And this is the next period that will happen now, where we will get all the actual detailed information of the property, and we'll show that to you in the next discussion, how we then go through the minute details. And once that is then checked, we come to a point where it comes back to the investment committee, and that is what we call the final release, or let's call it investment release. Mm-hmm. And then there's no turning back. Then we are just going through the motions of buying the building, getting the loans, and then setting it up to operate. Yeah.
So this is the first pass due diligence. This is to find out whether it's worthy or not of taking to the next level.
Correct.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you very much.